In previous presentations, we have seen consistent evidence of the associations shown in this illustration. Educational attainment has been consistently linked with a range of health-related behaviors, and these behaviors have been shown to be substantial contributors to both the length and the quality of the life experience. However, looking at education alone does not provide a full picture of the root causes and contributors to disparities in well-being. As I discussed at the close of the previous presentation, social inequality also plays an important role. In this presentation, we will look at the ways two forms of social inequality affect outcomes: socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity. We will see how experiencing economic inequality has direct links to all three stages of this model, as does a person's race or ethnicity. Throughout this course, we will need to consider the ways in which social and economic inequality affect well-being. As a first step, let's look at some of the measures of health status we looked at earlier, only this time through a consideration of race, ethnicity, and socioeconomics. A boy baby born in the United States in 2010 could expect to live on average 76.5 years if he was white. If instead he was black, the average life expectancy was only 71.8 years. For girl babies, the average life expectancy was 81.3 years if she was white and 78 years if she was black. In the United States, life expectancy at birth differs markedly depending on the race of the baby. Now, rather than looking at the average expected length of life, let's ask what the baby's chances are of dying in infancy. For every 1,000 babies born in the U.S., how many will die before reaching their first birthday? For white infants, the average mortality rate in 2010 was 5.1 per thousand. For black infants, that rate was 11.6 per thousand. Perhaps not surprisingly, the living conditions a child experiences have everything to do with his or her chances of death, independent of what the child's race is. A study published in 2007 by Singh and Kogan looked at the level of socioeconomic deprivation in the community in which a child lived, and the child's chance of dying before age 14. Socioeconomic deprivation was divided into quintiles, with those living in the most disadvantaged circumstances categorized as being in quintile number 1, and those living in the most advantaged circumstances in quintile number 5. The authors of the study asked two questions. First, was there a clear association between the level of deprivation in a community and the childhood death rate in that community? And second, how did this association change over time? They looked at data on death rates among children in the U.S. between 1969 and 2000. Using data from this study, this graph shows that for every step down the socioeconomic ladder, a child's chance of dying before age 14 went up. The fourth quintile had a higher death rate than the fifth quintile. The third quintile had a higher death rate than the fourth, all the way down the socioeconomic ladder to the first quintile, the children in the most deprived circumstances having the highest death rate. The graph also shows that the death rate for children went down consistently between 1969 and 2000. For each of the quintiles, the death rate in 2000 was substantially less than it was in 1969. Clearly, the U.S. had made substantial progress over this time period in avoiding childhood deaths. Despite this progress, the relationship of a child's level of socioeconomic deprivation and his or her chance of death didn't change. In 2000, the children lower on the socioeconomic ladder still died more often than those above them. We have seen that black infants die more often than white infants. We have also seen that children in socioeconomically deprived communities are at a higher risk of dying during childhood than children in more socioeconomically advantaged communities. Might it be that black infants are more likely to be born into and grow up in more socioeconomically deprived circumstances than white children? A brief look at the distribution of children by race within the different quintiles used in the study, comparing childhood death rates, answers this question. In 1990, children in the U.S. who lived in the first quintile, the most socioeconomically deprived quintile, 21% were black, 10% were Hispanic, 2% were Native American, 1% were Asian, with the remaining 66% white. By contrast, children in the fifth quintile, the most advantaged quintile, were 7% black, 7% Hispanic, 5% Asian, and more than about 80% white. Less than 0.5% of the children in the fifth quintile were Native American. Black, Hispanic, and Native American children are substantially more likely than white or Asian children to be born into severely disadvantaged circumstances with corresponding higher risk of death. Is the higher risk of infant death for black children due primarily to their race, or to the economic circumstances into which they are born, or to a combination of the two? This question gets somewhat more complex when we ask the same question but instead compare Hispanic and white infants. Hispanic children are also overrepresented in the most socioeconomically deprived quintile, although not nearly to the same extent as black children. However, in 2010, the infant mortality rate for Hispanic babies was 5.5 per thousand, only slightly higher than the rate of 5.1 per thousand for non-Hispanic white infants. Despite a higher risk of growing up in socioeconomically deprived circumstances, Hispanic infants have a mortality rate nearly identical to more socioeconomically advantaged white infants. At this point, I'd like to stop to mention that the categories of white, black, and Hispanic represent different ways of categorizing people. White and black are considered to be different races. On the other hand, Hispanic is not considered to be a race, but rather an ethnicity. This distinction has actually been written into federal policy and is used by the U.S. Census Bureau and by the U.S. National Center for Health Statistics in categorizing the population. We will talk about this distinction in more depth in a later module. For now, when I use the term white, I will mean someone who is white by race and non-Hispanic by ethnicity. The same is true for the term black. We see clear evidence of racial differences in life expectancy and infant mortality in parallel with socioeconomic differences in those same measures of the health status of a community or a society. If, instead, we look at the health status of adults, will we see the same differences? We will address this question by looking at the incidence of 4 chronic conditions that often affect adult health status. Hypertension, often referred to as high blood pressure, stroke, diabetes, and kidney disease. For each disease, we'll examine the percent of the population aged 18 and over with these conditions as reported in 2010 by the National Center for Health Statistics. Each comparison statistically adjusts for differences in age distribution among different populations. Among white adults in the U.S., 23.9% have hypertension. Among black adults, the rate is 34.1%, and for Hispanics, the rate is 22.5%. One of the most worrisome effects for those with hypertension is an increased risk of suffering a stroke. In 2010, 2.5% of the white population, 3.9% of the black population, and 2.6% of the Hispanic population suffered a stroke. The rates of hypertension and stroke among black adults was 40 to 60% higher than the comparable rate for either whites or Hispanics. We can examine the same illnesses through the lens of socioeconomic difference rather than racial or ethnic difference. First, using the highest level of education completed, we find that the rate of hypertension for those who have never finished high school is 31.7% as compared to 30.3% for those who finished high school but did not attend college, and 22.7% for those who completed a bachelor's degree or higher. Looking at stroke frequency, we see similar outcomes. The rate of stroke was 4.3% for those with less than a high school education, 3.4% for a high school education only, and 1.8% for those finishing college. We can look at the same question using household income rather than education as the measure of an individual's socioeconomic position. Not surprisingly, we see the same stepwise improvement in hypertension risk. Of those in households earning less than $35,000, the rate of hypertension was 27.8%. The comparable rate was 25.5% for those earning between $50,000 and $75,000, and 21.3% for those earning more than $100,000. Looking again at the frequency of strokes, we see that for those in households earning less than $35,000, the rate of stroke was 4.1%. The comparable rate was 2.6% for those earning between $50,000 and $75,000 and 0.9% for those earning more than $100,000. We'll now look at the prevalence of diabetes among the population. With diabetes, we see a somewhat different pattern of racial and ethnic difference, with the rate for Hispanics actually higher than the rate for blacks. In 2010, the diabetes rate was 7.6% for whites, 12.9% for blacks, and 13.2% for Hispanics. The comparable rate for kidney disease, a common complication of both diabetes and hypertension, was 1.5% for whites, 2.9% for blacks, and 2.1% for Hispanics. Looking at diabetes, instead by educational level, shows that rates of 14.7% for those with less than a high school education, 10.6% for a high school education, and only 7.1% for those with a bachelor's degree. The frequency of kidney disease was 3.1% for those with less than a high school education, 1.8% for a high school education only, and 1.0% for those finishing college. We can also look at rates of diabetes and kidney disease by household income, and we find diabetes rates of 11.2% for those with less than $35,000, 9% for those between $50,000 and $75,000, and 6% for those earning more than $100,000. And comparing kidney disease rates by household income shows 2.7% for less than $35,000, 1.2% for between $50,000 and $75,000, and 0.6% for those earning more than $100,000. When comparing health status among different groups in the United States, some of the difference we find seems to track racial differences. Much of the difference in health status seems to track socioeconomic status independent of race. However, we must also be aware that race and ethnicity often overlap with socioeconomic status. Those who are of a minority race or ethnicity are also more likely to be in a position of lower socioeconomic status. We get a clear indication of this overlap when we compare the level of educational attainment among whites, blacks, and Hispanics in the U.S. Among white adults, 7.6% never finished high school, 28.1% earned a high school diploma but did not attend college, and 34% earned a bachelor's degree or higher. Among blacks, the rates were 15.5% not finishing high school, 31.8% stopping at high school diploma, and 19.9% completing college. The rates for Hispanics were 35.7% not completing high school, 27% stopping at high school, and 14.1% completing college. Looking at the median household income tells a comparable story, with the median white household income earning 70% more than the median black household and 45% more than the median Hispanic family. A central message of this course and the subsequent modules is that the roots of health disparities are best understood as coming from the intersection of social class, race, and ethnicity.